Hi there, I'm Professor Jurus, and I wanted to make you a quick video and talk about Ganzfields. They're very exciting. And talk about a system of photography that I developed, or a process that I developed while I was attending The Ohio State University. And with these images, I got a lot of success using these images, getting into art galleries and art shows and so forth. So I wanted to share this process with you. I've been sharing it with my students for years. And it's a very exciting process, and you can create some very cool artwork with it. So the first thing that you have to know is what a Ganzfield is. And a Ganzfield is a field of view that has a homogeneous association. For example, a picture of gravel. If you took a photograph of gravel, it would just be very homogeneous throughout the whole picture. It's just going to look like gravel. So a picture of grass, if you went out and just took a photograph of grass, same thing. It's very homogeneous. It's just going to be the same, fluid throughout the whole photograph, looking the same way. So with this process, what you're going to do is you're going to shoot a bunch of photographs of Ganzfields, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go back and reshoot pictures on top of that. So this is all done in the camera, and whether you're using a 35mm camera or using a view camera, using film holders, or using a Hasselblad camera, I'm going to tell you how to do it successfully, basically using all three cameras: a 120 camera, a 35mm camera, a 4x5 camera, let's say a large format camera, because you could do the same thing using 8x10 sheet film or 4x5 sheet film. So let's start with the 4x5. What you're going to actually do is go out and get your film holders all loaded. Now again, the more film holders you have, the more pictures you're going to be able to take in one sitting. And I also do this in a very Zen-like approach to my photography. Some people are not so much. They write down and take notes. They number their film holders. Like they may say, number 1 film holder has gravel on it. Number 3 film holder is grass. Number 5 is leaves. Straw, something like that, so they know what's on the picture. But I don't keep track of that. I simply let what happens happen. So I would go out and shoot. I have quite a few film holders. I might load up 10 of them so that I would get 20 shots of film, and then I'm going to go out and actually photograph Ganzfields on the film. And when I photograph them, one of the things that I do is I underexpose them by 1 stop. So what I would do is either increase the shutter speed by 1 stop, so that if I was at a 60th of a second, I would raise the shutter speed to 125th of a second. Thereby I'm underexposing by 1 stop. Or I would increase my f-stop. So for example, on my f-stops, if my light meter told me that I was on f8 for the correct exposure, I would simply change it to f11, making the size of the aperture 1 stop smaller, and then underexposing the actual film by 1 stop. So I would go through and shoot all the Ganzfields like that. Now when you use a 4x5 film holder, when you take a picture, you change the dark slide so that the black side is out. And that's really handy in doing this process. So if I had 10 of these in there, 10 film holders, once I've gone through and shot, they would all be black on one side, and after they were white to begin with, so I changed them to black. And then what happens is when I go shoot the second shot, I'm going to switch them back to the white side, because I have all black film holders I'm starting with, and then I would know the white side already has the second shot on there on that piece of film. And I expose that part normally, and sometimes I might even, if I'm in a very dark situation, I'd like to use electronic flash and maybe even increase by 1 stop. So I'm maybe overexposing by 1 stop. So again, going back to the camera, if the exposure told me a 60th of a second, I might slow it down to a 30th of a second so I get more exposure on the second shot or the image. And this process, you can use it. I've seen students use it for a lot of different subject matter. I myself prefer using it for figurative artwork, models on black velvet. I have a huge piece of black velvet in my studio that I use that's perhaps 14 feet across by 16 feet long, and I'll generally put the subject, whether it's a person or a dog or something, on the black velvet, And by doing that, if we think about black velvet and we think about film, if we go back to our actual film, our negative, if you just took a piece of black, if you photographed a piece of black velvet, what would you have when you go back and expose it, develop the film and everything? You would just have a clear negative, because when you go to print it, it's going to be black. So the film comes out clear where the black velvet is, and that's where this process comes into play, or it works really unique. Because the black velvet, where it's clear in the film, you're going to be able to see the Ganzfield really easily, and where the subject is, you'll still see some of the Ganzfield bleeding through if you adjust your exposures correctly. And the methods I've given you, you can certainly adjust to them if they're not working for you. But again, when I do the second shot, I generally will use a strobe light and try to overexpose by one stop. And also, it's because I'm doing it on black velvet for the second exposure of the subject, it's very contrasty in there. So I will actually get some areas or shadow areas on the subject that will actually help the Ganzfield show up too, because those shadow areas are going to be, the density in them is going to be less than a negative, thinner, so more of the Ganzfield will show through at that point. So I will go out and photograph all my subjects, Ganzfields, and put the black side out, and then I'll take these back into the studio and I will photograph a subject on black velvet, increasing my exposure by one stop, and thus burning the image on top of the Ganzfield, and then coming up with the final print. And I'm going to show you some examples of some final prints that I've made that I've had great success with. Now let's look at real quick doing this with a 35mm camera. A 35mm camera is a little bit tricky, and you can certainly do it shot by shot if you know how to do the old double exposure in a 35mm camera. And the way you would simply do that is you would go ahead and take your picture of your Ganzfield, and then what you do is you push in the rewind knob when you cock the second shot, and then the film doesn't advance. And you can certainly do that shot by shot, but you're going to be going inside and out if you're doing it the way that I do it. So the way that I like to do it is, let me show you what I do, is I get the camera opened up here, and it's all about loading the camera correctly. And I will take my piece of film right here, or my roll of film, and I'm going to load my film into the camera. So let's get this loaded into the camera. And then I'm going to wind it a few times, and I really want to wind it so that it's in there nice and tight, and I want to make sure my film is fully advanced. Now before I close my camera back, I'm going to take my rewind knob and I'm going to tighten this so that the film is tight inside the camera. And then what I'm going to do is, you'll notice I've done this in this camera before, because I have, if you notice right here, I have a little black Sharpie mark right here, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger maybe so you can see that. So there's like a little edge right there. I put a little black mark on the camera with the Sharpie. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a mark on the roll of film right there. And what that's going to do for us is that's going to line the film back up after I've shot it. And that's important, because with 35mm, when you shoot a picture, what you actually get, is you get the clear lines, the clear space in between each frame. And you don't want to end up having a clear space going right through the middle of a great photograph. So you need to line the film back up for the second roll. So I would go out and shoot the whole roll of film. I would do this before I shoot the roll first thing. But once I've done this and made these marks on the film so that I know it's going to line up with the camera again, I'll go shoot the whole roll of film. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewind the film. So let's say I shot that roll of film. I'm going to rewind the film very carefully, because what I want to do is I want to feel when it comes off of the sprocket holes. And you can just, you'll kind of feel that when it's coming loose. And when it's coming loose, what you're going to, because you don't want to rewind the film back into the film spool. You want to then open up the camera back, and then what you want to do is you're going to want to, again, I'm going to take the film and I'm going to load it back into the camera, and this time it's going to be so that I can shoot the second shot on top of it. And basically what you're doing is you're just creating a whole roll of film that you can do double exposures over the top of. So I'll go ahead and wind this in right now. And you have to kind of play with it a little bit here, because you really need the marks to line up. I actually shot past it a little bit, which is good. Okay, so let's pull it back here just a little bit. And see, I'm using the rewind knob in this case to help this line up. There we go. So now that I have my little marks lined up in the camera right here, I have the mark on the film and I have the mark over here lined up. Okay, so once I do that, I can close the back, and then what I can do is go shoot the rest of my whole roll of film. Again, this time I'm going to be doing portraits, on top of that. And what'll happen then is the pictures are going to line up so that there's not a clear space in between each frame, and that the faces will line up. And that's a real simple way to do it. Now, the way that you do it, 120 roll film, what you're going to do is you're going to go, again, shoot the whole roll of film. Now with the Hasselblad, it's really easy because when you're loading the film back in a Hasselblad, there's a little arrow that you bring there's an arrow on the piece of paper in the 120 roll film, and when you're spooling it up, that arrow will come across, and there's a little arrow in the camera. So you want to line up the arrow on the film with the arrow on the camera back. And then you basically, once you do that, you put the film, the back together, click it over, and it starts on number 1. So you'd go shoot the whole roll of film with 120, and then this is the tricky part. You have to take the film back into the darkroom, and you have to take the film off of the spool, and then rewind it again, because it'll be on the spool backwards once you shot it one time. Now, it's easier if you have a second person to keep the film flat, because what's going to happen is it's going to get a tendency to put a loop between the paper and the film. So you have to practice it a couple times. If you have a spare roll, it might make sense to practice it a couple times with a test roll out in the light before you actually go take pictures and try it. So if you waste a roll of film, and unroll it, roll it onto another spool so it's backwards, like if it went from one spool to the other on the Hasselblad, and that's the way 120 works. You take it off of one spool and it goes onto the other. So take that spool that it went onto and then take it off of there and try to wrap it back so that you can start it through the camera again. And once you've mastered that so that you roll them nice and tight, it's not an easy thing to do. It takes a while to learn it, but once you've done that, you can go through and use a Hasselblad all the time, or a 120 camera, an RB67. You can even do it in the Holga that way, once you've learned to rewrap it. So anyway, I hope this helps. We're going to look at some images now. At the end of the images, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, smash the subscribe button, and we're good to go. Have a good time out there taking pictures. Thank you. Okay, what I wanted to do now is show you some of the images that I created when I was starting with this at Ohio State. So this is one of the first images, and again, it was shot with a 4x5 view camera. And the first photograph that I took, again, and this one was a Ganzfield, and I was photographing puddles. And a lot of these pictures you're going to see, they were shot of puddles of water with like leaves floating in them and stuff, like on the sidewalk. So you see concrete and you see leaves. Kind of a cool effect right here going on. And then the second exposure on the piece of film was the self-portrait of myself against black velvet, and again using a strobe light. So, and again you can see that because the picture blends together, which is kind of really cool. That's the effect that you get with a Ganzfield when you're doing that. And here's another one, and this one's actually kind of cool because there was a reflection in the puddle of water on the sidewalk, and that's kind of what I was photographing, and photographing the concrete. So maybe not technically a total Ganzfield, but just the idea of the double exposure, what's going on here, and then the figurative, the model I had on black velvet, and it came out pretty nice, I think. And here's another one that was done the same way, and you really can't get the coolness of the photograph if you're just doing double exposures. But by photographing the subject again on black velvet, I had so much clear area, zero density on the negative. That's why it gives you this ability to kind of blend through right here. And this was done again 4x5 view camera, black velvet with the subject, and the Ganzfield, or the photograph was taken with this puddle of water showing these reflection of the trees. Here's another one, and one of the things I said earlier was that I didn't keep track of any of my film holders. So this series right here was probably mostly done around this puddle of water, where I was simply photographing the film holders. I was shooting single shots of the puddles of water and stuff, and then I just tossed them into my bag with not really making notes of what was on them, and then went back and exposed the figured or images over the top on black velvet, and that's how these came out. Here's another one, and again, this was just a photograph. This wasn't a Ganzfield, but I took this photograph and then I did the photograph of the model standing against black velvet, and that's why it kind of blends together the way it does. And then finally, I wanted to show you this picture, and this is actually the picture that started it all for me in my experimentation with Ganzfields. And what I did with this photograph was, this was using a Hasselblad camera. All the other ones I showed you were done using a view camera. So this is with the Hasselblad, where I actually went back in and I re-rolled the roll of film after I shot it. Put it back the way it goes so that it'll feed into the camera again. And what I photographed on this roll of film, I still remember this, was I was out shooting the colorful leaves on the campus at Ohio State in the fall of 1984. I shot this, and I was taking my camera, and I probably shot this around the 15th or 30th of a second, and I was simply just panning the leaves. So I had the right exposure in the camera, and I just put my camera up, I focused on the leaves, I fired the camera, and then I panned it, so I drifted it. Um, and by drifting it, I created all these streaks of the leaves blurring on the film. And I went through and shot the whole roll of film. And then what I did is I took it into a dark room. You have to rewind it in a dark room. You can't do it in the room with safe lights. It has to be totally black. And you take the film off of the spool, um, and then you put it back on the opposite way, so that the part where the film is taped is going to be the part that pulls through the camera again, and the loose end of the film will be at the very end part you're winding. And that's why it's a little bit tricky when you're learning to do this. And I suggested earlier in the film that earlier in this video that you actually waste a roll of 120 film and take it out in the light and take it off of the spool and try to put it back on the spool. And so you can see how that, like, it'll kind of want to bunch up and get big, but you got to kind of keep it tight when you're winding it so that it'll work effectively. And then what I did after I shot that roll of film with the trees being blurry is I went back in. This is self-portrait, um, done on a piece of black. There's a piece of black velvet hanging behind me on the wall, and what I did is I took these masks up here and I simply taped them. I put a big piece of tape behind them and stuck them to the black velvet, so they're on the black velvet. And again, since they're on the black velvet, that area gets no exposure. Black velvet absorbs all the light. Now, if you use like black cardboard or something, that might cause some reflections and stuff, different black material, but black velvet works really good for absorbing all the light. You'll actually get a zero density if you just took a picture of the straight black velvet on your negative, so it works really well. And then I just, shot myself on this with the flash. I went through and shot the whole roll of film, and then this was one of the images that I liked the best. So hopefully this video helps you to shoot some Ganzfields and shows you some different ways to shoot double exposures. And again, if you like it, hit the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Have a good time out there taking pictures.